Hey everyone, this is just a really quick recap video for what we covered in week 2, specifically the second video in week 2. I think some people came away from that video a little confused, and that's totally understandable because we covered a bunch of ideas in a short amount of time. So, to recap, the central question we asked in week 2 was, can we trust God with our pain? Can we say God is in control of our pain and God is good at the same time, or do we need to choose between those two beliefs, God's control of our pain and God's goodness? Now, we assumed that God is in control, so our job was then to see if it's also possible to say that God is good. And to do that, we looked at the death of Jesus, who, according to the Christian faith, was God. We asked, can Jesus help us understand whether we can trust God with our pain? But things got a little bit confusing because there are two different ways to ask that question. One has an emotional emphasis of whether we can find comfort from trusting God with our pain, and the other has an intellectual emphasis of can God's control of our pain and His goodness fit in the same picture of reality. So the emotional question is pretty much, is this worth it? When I'm suffering, is this worthwhile? Does it have a purpose? Does it accomplish anything? And we saw that because God suffered with us. He sympathizes with us. He asked that question, is this worth it, too? We know God has asked this question, and we know God has answered this question, yes, it is worth it. We know those things because God, unlike us, has control over whether he suffers. And only an idiot wouldn't ask this question before choosing to suffer, or would choose to suffer even though he knows it's not worth it. So God's choice to suffer provides us with emotional comfort, knowing that God understands what we're going through and that neither God's suffering nor our suffering is wasted. But sometimes we need more than emotional comfort. Sometimes we're looking more for intellectual comfort. Sometimes our pain is actually amplified by nagging questions, by wondering, does this anguish that I'm going through mean God just isn't good? Does this particular individual pain provide evidence about what reality is really like? Does it provide evidence that God made a bad world? And if God made a bad world, that means no suffering is worthwhile, because it's never worth suffering to bring about something bad. And it also means that God himself is bad, because only God would make a bad world. And of course, if God's bad, he's not good, and we can't trust him. So I think we can answer this intellectual question first by saying, as we just saw in response to the emotional question, that Jesus' death in this world proves that he thinks this world is good. Jesus wouldn't choose to sacrifice himself. He wouldn't be willing to suffer for something he thinks is bad. But there's an issue when we're asking this intellectual question, because not knowing what is good, not being right about what is good, is just one way of being bad. If someone has really deviant moral intuitions, that just means they're really morally corrupt. So the question then becomes, is Jesus right about right and wrong? Or is he wrong about right and wrong? Well, I think that the character Jesus demonstrated in his life shows us that we can trust Jesus' judgment about what is good and what is bad. Jesus is capable enough to decide whether this world is a good world. So I think we can find intellectual comfort because Jesus' death and life tell us, no, God did not make a bad world. And then answering this intellectual question helps us find emotional comfort because it reinforces and gives us more confidence in our belief that yes, our suffering is worth it. So, there are emotional and intellectual ways to ask this question. Can we trust God with our pain? And our answers to these emotional and intellectual questions are intertwined. I think that the life and death of Jesus provide evidence that we can answer both the intellectual and emotional questions. Yes, we can trust God with our pain.